Jeremy Williams leaned back in the plush leather chair behind his sprawling oak desk, the glow of his laptop screen casting a faint light across his face. The office was still, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning, but his thoughts churned with a restless energy. He'd built his real estate empire from nothing, starting with modest homes in overlooked neighborhoods and climbing to glittering luxury properties that dotted the East Coast's most coveted cities. Fairness, grit, and respect were the pillars of his success, values he'd woven into the fabric of his company. But now, an email stared back at him, its words like a crack in the foundation of everything he had worked for. The message was short but searing, an anonymous tip from a customer who'd felt the sting of racial discrimination at one of Jeremy's top-performing agencies in New York City's upscale core. The accusation was specific: a white salesman had brushed off clients of color, tossing out derogatory remarks and assuming they couldn't afford the high-end properties the agency showcased. Jeremy's jaw tightened as he reread the email, each line sinking deeper into his gut. He'd heard murmurs before, vague complaints that never quite solidified, but this was different. The raw frustration in the words, the exhaustion of being judged, hit him hard. It wasn't just a complaint, it was a challenge to everything he believed his company stood for. He rose from his chair, hands gripping its back, and gazed out the floor-to-ceiling window. New York's skyline glittered below, a city of dreams and divisions, where opportunity and prejudice often walked hand in hand. The rumors had been simmering for months, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. This wasn't just a problem, it was a betrayal of his vision. He could have delegated the investigation, sent a manager to poke around, but that wasn't his way. If his company was failing its clients, he needed to see it for himself. Action was his instinct, and he trusted it. The plan came together swiftly. He'd go undercover, posing as an everyday buyer, no tailored suits, no Rolex, no hints of the wealth that defined his public persona. He wanted to experience the agency as his clients did, especially through the eyes of the salesman named in the email, David Harper. Jeremy glanced at his phone as it buzzed with a reminder about a board meeting. He fired off a quick text to his assistant, pushing it back. This couldn't wait. Before heading out, he caught his reflection in the window. He'd long mastered the art of navigating different worlds, adjusting his appearance to fit the room. For this, he traded his crisp suit for a plain black hoodie and jeans, simple, unassuming, the kind of outfit that wouldn't raise eyebrows but wouldn't scream money either. He called his driver, instructing him to drop him a block from the agency. This wasn't about grand entrances, it was about truth, unfiltered. As he stepped onto the busy New York sidewalk, a surge of purpose steadied him. He wasn't just a CEO today. He was a man determined to protect the integrity of his business and the dignity of those who walk through its doors. The agency's sleek glass facade loomed ahead, a modern shrine to wealth and exclusivity. Jeremy's pulse quickened as he approached, his mission sharpening with every step. Respect wasn't just a buzzword in his company, it was a promise he intended to keep. He took a deep breath, adjusted his hoodie, and pushed through the glass doors, ready to uncover the reality lurking beneath the polished surface. Inside, the office gleamed with calculated perfection. The marble floors shone like a mirror, reflecting the abstract art on the walls and the minimalist furniture arranged in the waiting area. It was a space designed to intimidate, to whisper wealth to anyone who entered. Behind the reception desk, a woman in her early 30s looked up with a practiced smile. Her nameplate read Lydia Evans, and her navy blazer and neat bun screamed professionalism. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice warm but measured, honed by countless greetings. "How can I assist you today?" Jeremy returned a small smile, keeping his demeanor neutral. "I'm looking to check out some properties in the area." Lydia's smile brightened, but before she could respond, a man strode out from a glass-walled office nearby. Jeremy knew him instantly from the email's description: David Harper. Tall, mid-40s, with slicked back light brown hair and a suit that screamed success. David carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. His eyes flicked over Jeremy, taking in the hoodie and sneakers in a single, dismissive glance. Without so much as a nod to Lydia, he inserted himself into the conversation. His tone clipped. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Jeremy replied evenly. I just wanted to see what's available. David's gaze lingered a beat too long, sizing him up. The silence was heavy, and then a thin, polite smile curved David's lips, one that didn't reach his eyes. We deal in luxury properties here, he said, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. Very high-end. You might find something more in your range at another agency. Lydia shifted behind the desk, her smile faltering for a split second. Jeremy caught it but kept his focus on David, who was already angling to end the interaction. The dismissal was clear, and David wasn't subtle about it. I know what you specialize in, Jeremy said, his tone calm but firm. That's why I'm here. David's eyes narrowed, as if recalculating his approach. With a barely concealed sigh, he relented. Fine, I can show you a few listings, but honestly, I don't think these will suit you. These are major investments. The implication hung in the air. You don't belong here. Jeremy felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, but he kept his expression steady. He'd faced this kind of judgment before assumptions that a man like him couldn't possibly afford the life he'd built. It was tiring, infuriating. But today wasn't about his pride. It was about exposing the rot within his company. I'll decide what suits me, he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make David pause. With an exasperated glance at Lydia, David barked, Pull up the Chelsea on 5th Penthouse listings. He didn't wait for her response, gesturing for Jeremy to follow him to a small meeting room. Lydia shot Jeremy a quick, apologetic look, but he just nodded. She wasn't the issue here. The meeting room was as cold as the rest of the office, all glass and sharp angles. David swiped through a tablet, barely glancing at Jeremy as he rattled off details. These are in the 8 to 10 million range, he said, his tone flat, as if he were humoring a child. Very exclusive. You'd need bank pre-approval to even think about an offer. Let me see the details, Jeremy said, keeping his voice casual. David hesitated, then slid the tablet across the glass table. I'm just trying to save you time, he added, his words dripping with false concern. Jeremy glanced at the screen, where images of sleek penthouses glowed properties he knew intimately, as he owned several of them. But he played along, wanting to see how far David's arrogance would stretch. I've got time, he said, meeting David's gaze. David's smirk was more grimace than smile. He launched into a half-hearted spiel about a property with a rooftop terrace and modern finishes, priced at $8.5 million. His impatience was palpable, and then he dropped the mask entirely. Look, let's be real, he said, leaning back in his chair. People like you can't afford places like this. This is for serious buyers executives, high-income professionals. No offense, but we both know this is a waste of time. The words landed like a slap, raw and unfiltered. Jeremy's pulse spiked, but he kept his face a mask of calm. There it was, the truth, laid bare. People like me, he asked, his voice low and deliberate. David shrugged, unfazed. You know what I mean. These properties require real financial muscle. Let's not kid ourselves. Jeremy studied him for a long moment, weighing his next move. He could end this now, reveal his identity, and watch David's world crumble. But that would be too easy. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice, it was about the culture that let it fester. He needed to see this through, to understand the full scope of the problem. Without a word, he slid the tablet back across the table. You're right, he said, his tone clipped. Let's not waste time. David blinked, caught off guard by Jeremy's sudden agreement. Okay, he stammered, clearly expecting more resistance. The walk back to the lobby was silent, save for the echo of their footsteps on the polished floor. David's arrogance radiated off him. He'd dismissed Jeremy as easily as he'd likely dismissed countless others. To him, Jeremy was just another face that didn't fit his narrow definition of a serious buyer. At the front desk, Lydia looked up, her hands hovering over her keyboard, caught between professionalism and unease. David slowed, already slipping into a tone of finality. If you're looking for something more reasonable, he said, the word laced with meaning. There are other agencies nearby that might be a better fit. Jeremy's frustration simmered, but he held it in check. Reasonable? He'd heard that word too many times in his life. Always code for you don't belong. This wasn't about price. It was about David's assumption that Jeremy could never be a player in this world. I never said I wanted something reasonable. Jeremy replied, his voice steady but firm. David sighed, his irritation breaking through. Look, I've been in this game a long time. I can tell within minutes who's serious and who's just window shopping. Jeremy tilted his head, his eyes locking onto David's. And what makes you think I'm just browsing? David's smile faltered, his confidence wavering for the first time. He hadn't expected pushback. I'm just being honest, he said, recovering quickly. These properties need serious backing. Unless you've got a bank letter or... I don't need a loan, Jeremy cut in, his voice quiet but unyielding. The air in the sleek Manhattan real estate office was thick with tension, the kind that hums beneath polite smiles and practiced professionalism. Jeremy stood at the center of it, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, catching every flicker of David Harper's thinly veiled disdain. David, with his tailored suit and polished demeanor, had been tossing subtle jabs all afternoon, each one laced with an arrogance that Jeremy had grown tired of dodging. These properties, David said, his voice smooth but dripping with condescension, aren't exactly for everyone. They're not starter homes, you know. His raised eyebrows suggested he found Jeremy's presence almost amusing, as if he couldn't quite believe someone like him would dare step into this world of glass and steel. Behind the reception desk, Lydia fidgeted, her fingers nervously shuffling a stack of papers that didn't need organizing. Her eyes darted between the two men, her discomfort palpable. She opened her mouth once, as if to say something, but quickly pressed her lips shut, choosing silence over confrontation. Jeremy caught her glance for a fleeting moment, searching for an ally, but she looked away, her hands betraying her unease. She wasn't the problem here, but her silence hung heavy, a quiet accomplice to the tension filling the room. Jeremy leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto David's. You know what's fascinating, he said, his voice calm but edged with purpose. You've spent this entire conversation telling me what I can't afford, but you haven't once asked me what I'm looking for. David blinked, his confident mask slipping for just a heartbeat before he recovered, his lips curling into a tighter smile. Like I said, he replied, his tone now clipped. I'm just trying to save us both some time. Jeremy straightened, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Every fiber of him itched to shatter David's assumptions right then and there to reveal who he really was and watch the man scramble to backtrack. But that would be too simple, too fleeting. Jeremy had bigger plans, ones that required patience and precision. It's funny, he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet frustration, how people like you are so quick to decide what others can or can't have, yet you know so little about them. David's eyes narrowed, his polished exterior cracking just enough to show his irritation. People like me, he echoed, his tone sharp now. Jeremy didn't flinch. Yeah, he said smoothly. People who judge based on a hoodie instead of a suit. People who think wealth has a certain look when it doesn't. Lydia shifted again, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk, her shoulders tense. She felt the weight of the exchange, but David seemed oblivious, his face tightening as he crossed his arms, ready to shut this down. Look, I'm not here to argue, he said, his voice firm. I'm just being realistic. These properties are for serious buyers executives, high net worth individuals, people with real financial power. And how do you know I'm not one of those people, Jeremy asked, his voice level but heavy with intent. The question hung in the air, unanswered for a moment. David let out a chuckle, but it was hollow, lacking any real warmth. Come on, he said, as if it were obvious. We both know people like you don't just walk in off the street and buy places like this. That's not how it works. The words hit like a slap, but Jeremy didn't react, not outwardly. Inside, his frustration churned, a slow boil fueled by the familiar sting of bias, subtle but unmistakable. David didn't see Jeremy for who he was. He saw only what he assumed Jeremy should be, based on nothing more than appearances. Jeremy let the silence stretch, feeling David's impatience grow, his eagerness to dismiss him and move on to a client who fit the part. Finally, Jeremy spoke, his voice calm but resolute. I see, he said. Well, I won't take up any more of your time. David's shoulders relaxed, his satisfaction evident. Yeah, that's probably for the best, he said, already turning away. Good luck finding something more in your range. Jeremy gave a small nod, then glanced at Lydia. Her eyes were fixed on the desk, her fingers still toying with the papers. When she finally looked up, their gazes met, and in that brief moment, Jeremy saw the guilt in her expression. She knew what was happening, had seen the truth unfold, but she hadn't said a word. Thank you, Jeremy said to her, his tone softer but pointed, a quiet acknowledgement of her unspoken awareness. Lydia nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. You're welcome, she whispered, barely audible. With that, Jeremy turned and walked toward the glass doors, the weight of David's ignorance trailing behind him. As he stepped onto the bustling New York street, the cool air hit his face, clearing his mind and sharpening his resolve. David Harper had no idea what was coming. Tomorrow, Jeremy would return, and everything would change. The next morning, Jeremy stood at the base of the same towering office building, its glass facade glinting in the early sunlight. He was dressed much like the day before jeans, a casual shirt, nothing ostentatious, but his mindset was different. Today, he wasn't here to be brushed off. He was here to make a point. Inside, Lydia was at her desk, her fingers tapping rapidly at her keyboard. When she saw him enter, recognition flashed across her face, followed by a hesitant smile. She nodded but quickly looked back at her screen, avoiding his gaze. David was there too, leaning casually against the reception counter, chatting with another agent. When he noticed Jeremy, he paused mid-sentence, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Jeremy caught at the subtle narrowing of David's eyes. The quick calculation. Then came that same thin smile from yesterday. Back again. Huh, David said, pushing off the counter and strolling toward Jeremy, his hands slipping into the pockets of his tailored trousers, still looking. Jeremy met his gaze evenly. Yes, he said, his voice firm. I want to see the property you mentioned yesterday. David blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness. He recovered quickly, though, his tone shifting to one of practiced professionalism. The penthouse, sure, we can do that. Just hope you know what you're getting into. Jeremy offered a small smile but said nothing. He'd heard enough of David's assumptions yesterday to know exactly what the man thought of him. There was no need to keep circling the same ground. Follow me, then, David said. All business now. It's just a short walk. They stepped out into the crisp morning air, the city alive with the hum of commuters and the distant honk of taxis. The tension between them was subtle but ever present, like a low current running beneath their steps. When they reached the building, David swiped a key card to unlock the entrance, leading them into a sprawling lobby with marble floors and soaring ceilings, designed to awe anyone who crossed its threshold. Jeremy had seen places like this before, owned a few, in fact, but today, in David's eyes, he was just another hopeful buyer, likely out of his depth. These units are top tier, David said as they stepped into the elevator, his voice carrying that rehearsed polish, the kind of place where you get what you pay for. There was an undercurrent of arrogance in his words, impossible to miss. Jeremy leaned against the elevator wall, watching him closely. What exactly does that mean, he asked, his tone calm but probing. David glanced at him, his expression guarded. I mean, it's not just about the property, it's about the lifestyle, the people who live here. You're paying for exclusivity, privacy. You won't have to worry about undesirable neighbors. The implication was clear. Hidden just beneath the surface, a suggestion that some people, perhaps people like Jeremy, didn't belong in a place like this. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to the penthouse floor. David stepped out first, gesturing for Jeremy to follow. They walked down a short hallway to the penthouse door, which David unlocked with a flourish, stepping aside to let Jeremy enter. The space was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The open concept layout amplifying the sense of grandeur. Sleek finishes and high-end furnishings completed the picture, staged to impress even the most discerning buyer. Jeremy wandered through the space, taking it all in. It was an exceptional property. No doubt, but today wasn't about the penthouse. It was about the man behind him, still sizing him up, still deciding whether Jeremy was worth his time. This one's listed at 8.5 million, David said, strolling over to the windows, fully furnished, private elevator, rooftop terrace, state-of-the-art kitchen. You won't find better in this part of the city. Jeremy nodded, his expression neutral. He knew this building well, had even helped finance its development years ago, but David didn't need to know that yet. And the neighbors, Jeremy asked, keeping his tone light. I'm assuming they're the right kind of people. David turned to face him, his smile tight, saying everything without saying it outright. Let's just say you'd fit right in if you've got the means to stay. The condescension was blatant now, and Jeremy's patience was fraying. He'd come here to give David one last chance to show his true colors, and the man wasn't even pretending anymore. You think I don't have the means, Jeremy said, his voice sharp but controlled. David hesitated, his smile faltering for a moment before he doubled down. Look, I'm just being honest, he said, his tone defensive now. You know how this works, this lifestyle, these properties, they're not for everyone. Jeremy walked over to the windows, gazing out at the sprawling city below. His frustration simmered, but he kept it tightly reined in. This wasn't the moment to lose control, not yet. And what makes you so sure it's not for me, he asked, turning to face David, his gaze unflinching. David laughed softly, as if the question were absurd. Come on, I've been in this business long enough to know. It's nothing personal. It's just the reality. Reality, Jeremy repeated, his voice thoughtful but laced with steel. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on David's. The reality is you don't know a thing about me. You took one look at me and made up your mind. David's smile wavered, and for the first time, Jeremy saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I'm just trying to be realistic about what you can afford, David said, but the confidence was gone, replaced by a defensive edge. And what exactly do you think I can afford, Jeremy pressed, closing the distance between them? Because it sounds to me like you think people who look like me don't belong in places like this. David stiffened, his eyes narrowing. I didn't say that, he snapped. But the denial was weak, unconvincing. You didn't have to, Jeremy replied, his voice low and unwavering. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. David shifted uncomfortably, clearly rattled, but unwilling to concede. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight. Look, I don't know what you're trying to imply, but I'm just doing my job. I show properties to serious buyers. If that's not you, then you'll know soon enough whether I'm a serious buyer. Jeremy cut in, his tone final. David blinked, confused for a moment, then masked it with his usual arrogance. Well, like I said, if you have the means, we can talk. Otherwise, I think we're done here. Jeremy stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, David. We are done here. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing through the empty penthouse. David stood frozen, watching him leave, still oblivious to the storm he'd just ignited. As Jeremy stepped back into the elevator, a quiet resolve settled over him. Tomorrow, things would be different. Tomorrow, David Harper would learn exactly who he'd underestimated. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, but inside the sleek offices of Harper Realty, a storm was brewing, one that David Harper, with his polished suits and unshakable confidence, didn't see coming. He'd spent years perfecting his swagger, striding through the office like a king, dismissing anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of success. But yesterday, a man named Jeremy Williams had walked through those glass doors, and everything was about to change. Back at the office, Lydia sat at her desk, her fingers dancing across the keyboard, though her focus wavered. David burst through the entrance, his grin wide and smug, as if he'd just conquered a battlefield. He made a beeline for Lydia, leaning against her desk with a casual arrogance that made her stomach twist. Well, that's done, he said, chuckling as if the world were his personal stage. I knew that guy wasn't serious the second he stepped in here yesterday. Lydia's eyes flicked up from her screen, her lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the heat of frustration rising in her chest. but she kept her face composed. "You don't think he was serious?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. David rolled his eyes, crossing his arms like he was humoring a child. "Come on, Lydia. You saw him, those clothes, that attitude, walking in here asking about penthouses. People like him don't just waltz in and buy million-dollar properties." His tone dripped with disdain, as if Jeremy's existence was an insult to his carefully curated world. Lydia's fingers hesitated over the keys. She'd heard David's dismissive rants before, brushing off clients based on their appearance or demeanor, but today felt different. She could still picture Jeremy's calm, unwavering presence as he stood his ground against David's subtle condescension. It gnawed at her, the way David reduced him to a stereotype without a second thought. "You don't know what he's capable of," she said softly, struggling to keep her tone neutral. "Not everyone wears their wealth on their sleeve." David snorted, shaking his head as if she'd told a bad joke. "Lydia, please. I've been in this game long enough to spot a wannabe a mile away. That guy, he's just another dreamer chasing a taste of the good life." Her hands clenched into fists beneath the desk, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to push back, to make him see how wrong he was. But David had a way of shutting down anything that challenged his worldview. Still, she couldn't stay silent. "You can't always judge a book by its cover," she said, her voice quieter now but firm. "He didn't strike me as someone wasting our time. Maybe you got it wrong." David's expression turned patronizing, his lips curling into a smirk. "Lydia, I don't have time to entertain every random guy who thinks he can afford a place he clearly can't. I know what a real buyer looks like." And that wasn't it. He straightened, already dismissing her words as if they were background noise. Lydia's patience frayed like a worn thread. She'd worked hard to carve out her place in this office, navigating its politics and egos. But David's attitude was a constant thorn in her side. Confronting him felt like shouting into a void he never listened, never cared. "You're making assumptions," she said, her voice tight with restraint. "And that's a risky move." David shrugged, his indifference like a slap. "Whatever, he's not coming back, and we've got bigger fish to fry. Let me know when a real client shows up." With that, he sauntered toward his office, leaving Lydia staring at her screen, frustration simmering in her veins. She wanted to do more, to say more, but David's influence loomed large, and she'd seen how he handled those who dared to challenge him. Still, something told her this wasn't the end. Jeremy's quiet strength lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the tides were about to turn. The next morning, Jeremy sat in his corner office, the city skyline sprawling before him like a canvas of ambition. The events of the previous day played on a loop in his mind: David's smug arrogance, his thinly veiled insults, the way he dismissed him without a second thought. Jeremy wasn't just another client. He was the owner of Harper Realty, and today he would make that abundantly clear. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about sending a message that echoed far beyond David's office door. He glanced at his watch, then stood, smoothing the cuffs of his tailored suit, a stark contrast to the casual attire he'd worn yesterday to test the waters. Today, he carried the weight of authority, his resolve as sharp as the click of his polished shoes on the marble floor. As his car pulled up to the real estate office, Jeremy allowed himself a moment to savor the irony. Yesterday, he'd been brushed off as insignificant. Today, he held the power to reshape the entire office. Stepping out of the car, he crossed the threshold of the glass doors, the soft hiss of their opening drawing every eye in the room. The sleek decor and polished floors felt hollow now, a facade for the unchecked arrogance that had festered under David's reign. Lydia looked up from her desk, her fingers freezing mid-keystroke as she registered Jeremy's presence. There was something different about him today, a quiet command that filled the space. "Good morning, Lydia," Jeremy said, his voice warm but professional. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," she replied, a flicker of unease in her tone. She sensed something monumental was unfolding, though she couldn't yet grasp its shape. "Is David in?" Jeremy asked, his tone smooth but unyielding. Lydia nodded, glancing toward David's office. "Yes, he's there. Do you want me to?" "I'll handle it," Jeremy cut in, his voice gentle but firm. Without hesitation, he strode toward David's office, his purpose clear. Lydia watched, her hand hovering over her mouse, a knot tightening in her chest. This was no ordinary visit. This was a reckoning. Jeremy knocked once, sharp and deliberate, then pushed the door open without waiting for a response. David sat at his desk, engrossed in a stack of papers, oblivious to the storm about to break. "David," Jeremy said, his voice steady as steel. David's head snapped up, his brow furrowing as he tried to place the man standing before him. Recognition flickered, followed by a flash of unease. "Mr. Williams," he said, standing awkwardly, his usual confidence faltering. What are you doing here?" Jeremy stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click that felt like a gavel's strike. He took his time, letting the weight of the moment settle. "You seem surprised," he said, raising an eyebrow. David forced a nervous laugh, his words stumbling. I didn't expect you to. I didn't know you were—" He trailed off, grasping for control, but finding none. "You didn't expect me to be your boss," Jeremy finished, his voice flat and unyielding. David froze, the truth crashing over him like a tidal wave. His eyes widened, his polished facade crumbling. "Wait, you're the owner?" "Yes, David," Jeremy said, his tone cold and precise. "I own this company, and yesterday you had the chance to treat me like any other client. Instead, you chose to judge me based on nothing but your own biases." David's face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "Mr. Williams, I didn't mean—" Jeremy raised a hand, silencing him. "Your actions spoke louder than any excuse you could offer. I built this company on the principle that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or how they present themselves. You've shown me you don't share that value." David's hands trembled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I didn't realize." "You didn't realize because you didn't care to," Jeremy interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "You didn't stop to consider that someone like me could be your client, your equal, or your boss. And that's why this company can't afford to keep you." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait, you're firing me?" "Yes," Jeremy said, his voice resolute. "Your behavior undermines everything this company stands for. As of today, your employment is terminated." David stammered, desperation creeping into his voice. But no words could undo the damage. He'd built his career on assumptions, and now those assumptions had toppled his world. Jeremy turned to leave, pausing at the door for one final glance. "Let this be a lesson. David, you never know who's walking through those doors. It's a pity you had to learn it this way." With that, Jeremy stepped back into the main office, leaving David frozen in his chair, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. Lydia's eyes followed Jeremy as he passed, wide with realization. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The shift in the air told her everything. Jeremy nodded to her, his expression calm but purposeful. "I'll be addressing the staff soon," he said. Lydia nodded back, a spark of gratitude in her eyes. She'd stayed silent too long, but Jeremy's actions spoke louder than her words ever could. Change was coming, and she felt it in her bones. As Jeremy exited the office, the glass doors parting once more, a quiet satisfaction settled over him. David had underestimated him, but the message was now unmistakable. Respect wasn't negotiable, and assumptions carried a heavy price. Later that day, Jeremy finalized the details for a staff meeting, determined to make this moment a turning point. This wasn't just about one man's dismissal, it was about redefining the soul of the company, ensuring that no one else would be judged the way he had been. The city skyline stretched before him, vast and full of possibility, and Jeremy knew he was just getting started. By the time Jeremy stepped into the office that late afternoon, a palpable shift had already swept through the space. The usual hum of productivity was replaced by hushed whispers and sidelong glances. Word of David's abrupt departure had spread like wildfire, leaving the staff buzzing with speculation. No one knew the full story, but the air was thick with the sense that something monumental was unfolding. Lydia sat at her desk, her posture rigid, her eyes flickering nervously toward the back office where Jeremy had met with David earlier that day. She'd watched David storm out, His face drained of color, lips pressed into a thin line as he brushed past her without a word. Now, as Jeremy strode into the office, his expression composed yet resolute. Lydia's stomach churned. She knew this was no ordinary day. This was the moment everything would change. Jeremy paused at her desk, his voice low but steady. "Lydia, gather the team in the conference room. I need to speak with everyone." Her fingers trembled as she typed out the group message, her mind racing. She'd been with the company long enough to sense that whatever was coming would reshape the office, for better or worse. Rising from her chair, she followed Jeremy into the sleek, glass-walled conference room, where the rest of the team would soon assemble. Within minutes, the staff trickled in, their murmurs filling the room as they exchanged uneasy glances. Jeremy sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his face unreadable, exuding a quiet authority that silenced the chatter. Lydia took a seat at the far end, her head bowed, but she could feel the tension coiling tighter with every passing second. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath for what was to come. Once the last person settled into their chair, Jeremy stood, and the room fell still. His presence didn't demand attention through loud gestures or theatrics. It simply commanded it, like a calm before a storm. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice even but weighted with purpose. "I've called this meeting to address something serious, something that strikes at the heart of what this company stands for." The silence deepened, every pair of eyes fixed on him. "As many of you know, I've spent years building this real estate business," Jeremy continued. "From the ground up, I've rooted it in principles of respect, fairness, and integrity. But recently, I've received disturbing reports about how some of our clients are being treated, specifically clients of color." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Colleagues exchanged fleeting glances, but no one dared speak. The weight of Jeremy's words hung heavy, and he let the silence stretch, giving it room to sink in. "Yesterday," he said, his tone steady but piercing, "I came into this office undercover, posing as a potential buyer. I didn't reveal who I was because I wanted to see firsthand how we treat clients who don't fit a certain image." Lydia's heart thudded in her chest. She knew exactly what was coming. She'd seen how David had treated Jeremy when he walked in his dismissive tone, the way he'd sized him up and written him off before even offering a handshake. Her stomach twisted with guilt as she realized Jeremy had witnessed it all. "I was met with condescension," Jeremy said, his voice calm but unyielding. "I was judged based on my appearance, on assumptions about what I could afford or who I was. I was spoken to as if I didn't belong, dismissed without a second thought." The room was now a vacuum of sound, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the gravity of the situation dawning on them. "I'm not here to point fingers or humiliate anyone," Jeremy went on, his gaze sweeping the room. "But I will say this, the person responsible for that behavior is no longer with this company." A few gasps punctured the silence, and the name on everyone's mind, David Harper, the office's golden agent, hung unspoken in the air. Jeremy let the revelation settle, his expression unwavering. Lydia sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd known David had crossed a line, but hearing Jeremy lay it bare made it painfully real. Relief washed over her. David was gone, but it was tangled with guilt. She'd seen it happen, known it was wrong, yet stayed silent. Why hadn't she spoken up? Jeremy's voice cut through her thoughts, firm but not harsh. What happened yesterday wasn't just one bad moment. It was a symptom of a deeper issue, one that has no place here. We serve people from every walk of life. Every single person who steps through our doors deserves the same respect, no matter how they look, how they dress, or where they come from. His eyes scanned the room, locking briefly with each person, ensuring his message landed. If anyone here believes otherwise, if you think you can treat clients differently based on your assumptions about who's worthy, then this isn't the place for you. The words weren't a threat, they were a promise, a line drawn in the sand. The old ways were done. Jeremy's tone softened, but his resolve didn't waver. I want this company to be a beacon of fairness, a place where people feel valued and welcomed, no matter who they are. That's the only path to success, and it's the only one I'll accept. He paused, letting his vision for the future take root. Starting next week, we'll be holding workshops and training sessions to ensure everyone understands these expectations. I expect full commitment, and I expect change. With that, he stepped back, his words lingering like a charge in the air. The meeting was over, but its impact would ripple through the office for days, maybe years. As Jeremy left the room, Lydia exhaled, her racing heart finally slowing. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. Jeremy had faced the problem head-on, setting a new standard that felt both daunting and inspiring. The office buzzed with the unease after the meeting. Small clusters of staff gathered, their whispers circling around David's sudden exit. The untouchable top agent, gone in an instant, it was almost unthinkable. Lydia returned to her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard, but her mind was elsewhere. The meeting had been brief, but its weight pressed on her. She hadn't spoken up when she could have. And now, with David gone, she wondered if she could have changed things sooner. Through the open door of Jeremy's temporary office, she could see him reviewing papers, his calm demeanor unshaken even after the bombshell he'd dropped. She admired his composure, but more than that, she respected his integrity. He'd handled the situation with grace and strength, and the consequences were clear for all to see. The phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Jenna, the regional manager, her voice cautious but urgent. "Lydia, I heard about David. Can you fill me in?" Lydia swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, David's no longer with the company. Mr. Williams addressed the team today and made it clear that changes are coming." There was a pause on the line. "I see," Jenna said slowly. "I'll be in later to go over everything." "This is serious." Lydia nodded, though Jenna couldn't see her. Of course, after hanging up, she leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting back to Jeremy. Something compelled her to speak with him, not as an employee, but as someone who'd witnessed the wrong and stayed silent. She stood, smoothing her blazer, and walked to his office, her pulse quickening. Knocking lightly on the doorframe, she caught his attention. Jeremy looked up, offering a small nod. "Lydia, come in." She stepped inside, her hands clasped nervously. "Mr. Williams, I wanted to talk about everything that happened." Jeremy leaned back, his expression open and attentive. "Go ahead." Lydia hesitated, searching for the right words. "I know what David did was wrong. I saw it happen, and I didn't say anything. I didn't know how to. And now that he's gone, I feel like I should have done more." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, the weight of her silence heavy on her chest. Jeremy studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "I appreciate your honesty, Lydia," he said, his tone measured. "David had a lot of sway here, and it's not easy to challenge someone like that. I understand why you didn't speak up." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, a small relief breaking through her guilt. "But I still feel like I should have said something," she admitted. "I knew it wasn't right, but I was afraid of what would happen." Jeremy sighed, leaning forward on his desk. Fear can be paralyzing, especially when certain behaviors have been allowed to slide for too long. But recognizing that now is what matters. It means you're ready to grow from this. His words eased the knot in her chest. She dreaded this conversation, but his understanding made it bearable. "I don't want this office to be a place where people are afraid to speak out," Jeremy continued. "That's why I'm making these changes. It's not just about David, it's about building a culture where everyone feels empowered to stand up for what's right." Lydia nodded, a mix of relief and resolve settling in her. She'd always wanted to do the right thing, but fear had held her back. Jeremy's vision for the future gave her a new sense of purpose. "I understand," she said softly, "and I want to be part of the solution." A small, genuine smile crossed Jeremy's face. "That's all I ask. Lydia, we're all learning, and we all have to hold ourselves accountable. If you're willing to be part of the change, that's what counts." She exhaled, feeling lighter than she had in hours. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "I won't let this happen again." Jeremy nodded, his expression kind but firm. I trust you won't. They sat in a brief, comfortable silence, the weight of the conversation settling into something productive. Is there anything else, he asked? Lydia shook her head. No, that's all. I just thank you for how you handled this. It couldn't have been easy. As she left his office, a quiet determination took root. The office was changing, and so was she. For the first time in a long while, the future felt not just possible, but promising. Jeremy's face broke into a warm, reassuring smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made the faint lines at their corners deepen with quiet confidence. No, it wasn't easy, he said softly, his voice steady but laced with conviction. But it was the right thing to do. Lydia met his gaze, her heart lifting at his words. She gave a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the weight they both carried. As she turned and made her way back to her seat, her steps felt lighter, purposeful. For the first time in what felt like forever, a spark of determination flickered within her. The fear that had once chained her decisions still lingered, a faint shadow in the back of her mind, but it no longer held the reins. Jeremy's trust in her was a rare and precious thing, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. Back in the office, the air buzzed with a quiet intensity. The events of the day had sent ripples through the team, and everyone seemed to move with a newfound caution. Conversations were muted, voices dropping to whispers as colleagues exchanged glances filled with unspoken questions. There was an electric sense of expectation, like the calm before a storm. Jeremy's leadership had shifted something fundamental. His decisive actions had set a new standard, and the staff was still grappling with what that meant for them. They weren't just adapting to a new day, they were stepping into a new era. As the workday drew to a close, Lydia found herself lingering at her desk, her thoughts drifting over the whirlwind of the past few hours. David's departure had left an undeniable gap, a hollow space where his presence once loomed large. But as painful as it was necessary. Jeremy had stood firm, proving to everyone what true leadership looked like, not just power or authority, but a quiet strength rooted in fairness, integrity, and an unflinching commitment to doing what was right, no matter the cost. His example had lit a fire in Lydia, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Outside, the sky darkened, painting the office windows with hues of deep blue and gold. Lydia's gaze wandered to the horizon, her mind already turning to the challenges that tomorrow would bring. There would be more obstacles, more changes to navigate, and undoubtedly more moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready, not fearless, but prepared. With Jeremy leading the way and a team beginning to find its footing, this was more than just the end of a difficult day. It was the dawn of a new chapter for the company, one filled with possibility and the promise of something better.